and I'm honored to introduce her to you today, Anita Moncrief.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm honored to be here today. I see a lot of familiar faces from my tours around Florida, and I'm glad you guys have made it out. And today we're going to talk about an issue that's really near and dear to my heart and very important for the sake of saving our republic, and that is voter fraud. I usually start off talking a little bit about my story, but I really want to get into the heart of some things that have been going on across the country that we may not be aware of, and to give you some history so you have a background as to where this all comes from. Now, I tell people all the time when I go across the country that if there's an election that is worth stealing, someone will steal it. And we go back to Kennedy versus Nixon. How many of you guys remember that? When Daley had every dead person in Cook County come out to get Kennedy elected. And Nixon knew he had lost the race because of voter fraud. They were well aware, and Nixon knew that he had an opportunity to get out there and to stop, to protest it and to stop it. But at that time, it seemed unseemly to win a presidential election by taking it to the courts. No one wanted to do that. So they didn't fight it. And Kennedy became president, and it set a precedent that would last for the next 40 to 50 years, where people would realize that it is easy to steal an election if you really want that person to win. And you do it in the counties where it's a close margin of victory. It's never an obvious cheating that goes on. It's always a few 100,000 votes here, a few thousand votes there. But it's been going on since the 60s. And that's what I want to talk to you guys about today. When Acorn started, they came out of Little Rock, Arkansas in the 70s. They came out of Arkansas at the same time that Bill Clinton was coming up through the ranks. When Clinton first tried to run for office, he wasn't very popular among the blacks, and that's what Acorn delivered for him. They delivered credibility among the black people. They gave him a reputation among the blacks as being just like them. And as a lot of people will tell you, before Barack Obama, they considered Clinton to be the first black president. Yes. So when he came to Washington, D.C. as president, the first thing he did was sign the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, Motor Voter. If you look, there is a picture of the signing ceremony with Maude Hurd, the president of Acorn, standing on one side of one side of Clinton, and Zach Paulette and Wade Rackey, two of the other founders of Acorn, standing on the other side. That was their gift. That was the gift to Acorn for getting Clinton elected. They came to Washington with him, right behind him, and the NVRA was their gift. Now you wonder, whoa, motor voter, registering people in driver's license agencies, what's bad about that? Most people don't talk about that other section of motor voter, which is Section 7, which talks about registering people in public assistance agencies. So across the country, they now had a federal law, a mandate saying that everyone in every single state that was under the NVRA, unless they had same-day registration, was required to register people in public assistance agencies, whether or not they were citizens or not, because you couldn't ask if they were a citizen, but you had to ask them if they were registered to vote and get them a voter registration application. So across the country in the 90s, while most people weren't paying attention, the voter rolls were becoming inflated and bloated by people that were ineligible to be on the rolls, people that had already voted and were added twice in different counties because they moved and never removed their name from the rolls in the old counties. And who did they have helping them with this? The Clinton Department of Justice. Anytime a state bucked back and said, hey, we've got illegals on our rolls, we've got people that are ineligible on our rolls, we need to clean them up, they would get a lawsuit by the Department of Justice coming under the Clinton administration. And no one, not any regular citizens, were paying attention to this and were aware of what was going on. States across the country were sued and were forced to allow these ineligible voters on their rolls, and in some cases to sign consent agreements which bound them to accept voters no matter what. I know right now in Harris County, Texas, there's a consent agreement in place because of a lawsuit that says no matter how fraudulent the application appears to be, they have to accept it until 2012. Until the end of this year, any application that comes through for voter registration has to be accepted. It's unacceptable, but this is exactly what was going on in the 90s. It was setting the stage for what we have right now, which are across the country, massively inflated voter rolls, dead voters, deceased voters, ineligible voters, people that don't exist, married women that never changed their names. All these people are on the rolls across the country, and that's because of the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. No one knew how much damage motor voter would do to our electoral system, except for ACORN and Project Vote and the Brennan Center for Justice and the ACLU and the NAACP and all these other far-left groups whose intention was to weaken our electoral system. So that's the first thing that they did. Now, how many of you guys remember the scandal involving Alberto Gonzales when he became Attorney General? Yes. Do you know why all of that happened? Because he was targeting states that were that had abnormally high applications coming in from these public assistance agencies, and he was proving that there was no way that they could have registered that many people. So what did they do? Project Vote and ACORN. Project Vote is ACORN's sister organization. It's a 501c3 nonprofit started in the 90s, and as most of you know, that's the organization that Barack Obama worked for. That organization teamed up with the Brennan Center for Justice and went after Gonzales for stopping their gravy train. They had 8+ years of a great DOJ that looked the other way as they committed all types of voter registration fraud across the country. And how dare this new DOJ want to stop that process? How dare them not want to file lawsuits against states for wanting to clear up their voting rolls and not to have ineligible voters? So they turned to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and they claimed racism and that they were targeting African Americans because they wanted to disenfranchise them. And Gonzales, unfortunately, was the cog in that wheel that got stuck, and he went under because people did not realize that this was much bigger than him. It was much bigger than the DOJ under Bush. This was them stopping something that they would continue, which they are continuing right now under Obama's DOJ with Holder. Once again, and this is one of the things that is amazing to me with Holder, is that they are not even pretending not to work with ACORN and Project Vote. We have Freedom of Information Act requests that were filed by the Judicial Watch out of D.C. that show that they are not only colluding with the DOJ, but employees of Project Vote are suggesting people to be hired by the DOJ to work in their civil rights division. So this is totally, even though ACORN has disbanded, they are totally controlling how our Department of Justice files lawsuits against states across the country. From Florida to South Carolina to Georgia to Texas, across the country, these states have had lawsuits filed against them under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, saying that they are disenfranchising minority voters. And as you guys know from how ACORN operates, what they do is they work in low income and minority areas, and they use them as a shield. And people get mad when I say it, but when I worked at ACORN, we called it Operation Darky Shield. You put us out there, you put the black people out there front, and as soon as anybody says anything, you go, oh, you're racist. You don't want black people to vote? Oh, you're racist for this. It works perfect. It covers up criminal activities because so many people are stopping to say, oh, I'm not racist, we're not doing this, and no one pays attention to all of the criminal activity that's going on behind that shield of black people that ACORN and Project Vote have tossed out there in front. But as soon as something goes wrong, they were not afraid to roll that bus right over those black people as well and to have them go to jail because they would teach them how to commit fraudulent registration on the local levels too. So this is what you have. You have a complex system of voter registration fraud that goes back to the 60s, that was perfected in the 90s, that had a little bit of a bump when Bush was in office, but is now going full force under Holder. I tell people that the DOJ has gone wild because it is not the Department of Justice anymore. It's the Department of Social Justice. They're out there and they're pushing an agenda that is against the interests of most American people. It is only a small group of people that they are representing right now, and that is none of the interests that lie in this room right now, which is about election integrity and free and fair elections. How many of you guys have heard of HAVA? HAVA. HAVA, the Help America Vote Act of 2002. That is another law that I want you guys to be very familiar with. After what happened in 2000 with the Florida elections, George Soros and his people realized just how important the Secretary of State's office was. As Stalin would say, it's not who casts the votes, it's who counts them. So they just knew Florida was going to go their way. And when it didn't, they were so angry. That anger manifested itself into millions of dollars that they spent to get friendly Secretary of States across the country. And one of the other things they did was to have HAVA. And what HAVA was on the Republican side was, number one, a quick way to get money to the states at that time. And number two, a way to guarantee that the voter rolls would be maintained, because HAVA specifies that the rolls have to be verified by either one type of database, whether it be driver's license records or social security numbers, What most people don't realize under HAVA is that there's another part that the leftists wanted, because they can stop voting rolls from being cleaned up very easily by filing a lawsuit, but they wanted provisional voting. HAVA requires provisional voting. So let's say I go into your precinct and I tell you I'm supposed to vote here. You can't find me anywhere on the rolls, but I'm insistent. You give me a provisional ballot and I fill it out, and it's supposed to be verified within 7 days of the election. But in very close elections, such as what happened with Norm Coleman and Al Franken in Minnesota, those provisional votes were not verified and they were double counted. So they didn't stamp, they copied them, and they were supposed to stamp them as copies, but they didn't do that. So they counted them twice for Franken, which is how we got our 60th vote for health care. And Mark Ritchie was one of the Secretary of State project people that was put in under Soros. He pumped millions of dollars into his race to get him elected, and he was also tried to run for Senate as his reward for giving us Al Franken. Jennifer Brunner in Ohio, Robin Carnahan in Missouri. Across the country, these so-called friendly Secretary of States are just waiting to be activated or have been activated. Brunner passed so many laws in Ohio that really weakened the electoral system, to the point where I tell people that Ohio is going to be our Florida this year. Pay very close attention to what comes out of Cayuga County and some of those other counties in Ohio, because it's going to be nasty, and it's probably going to go to the courts, because we've seen where they've set the stage for this to happen by weakening the electoral laws, by signing consent agreements, and by organizing Obama for America on the ground for the past 7 months, registering voters. So that's what's going on right now. But back to the Help America Vote Act. So when you have provisional voting going on across the country, you have people with vested interest in how these ballots are counted. And in some cases, they are not verified as stated. So you have a problem right now and across the country with laws that were intended to help America and help our electoral system that are being used to destroy it. And we are not aware of it. We're mostly complacent because we're trusting our governments and we're trusting our local Secretary of States to do the right thing. But let me tell you a story that happened in 2010. We were in, San Diego, California. And there was a Republican poll watcher and a Democrat poll watcher outside. They were outside videotaping the activities that were going on, and they weren't, officially assigned inside the polls. What they saw was a bus pull up to the polling station full of people that I will say did not appear to be citizens of this country. The people were given pieces of paper because they could barely speak English and told, this is who you vote for. They went in there and in some cases just handed the paper to the election officials, and they were given, a clearance to go in there and vote. So this was videotaped from the outside with them handing the people a piece of paper, telling them, say, this is who you are, this is your address, by two parties. Both parties went down to the Board of Elections and turned that information over. What happened? They gave those tapes. They were forced to sign a confidentiality agreement, and those tapes disappeared. They have never been seen from again. So this is what happens when we trust our Board of Elections and our county elections to do the right thing. If there's a partisan interest there and it's uncovered, people will try to stop it, even if it's coming from both sides. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. How do we get involved? We need to be aware not only of the laws that are affecting us, but of the lawsuits and what's going on across the country, because it doesn't matter if you're Santorum or Gingrich or Romney or whoever. If you get there in the elections are stolen from us is not going to matter. Right now, we have allegations that are still coming out almost 4 years later from 2008 showing massive voter registration fraud across the country and voter fraud as well, voter impersonation. Just about a week ago, we had 7 Acorn employees that were indicted in Pennsylvania for voter registration fraud coming out of the 2008 elections. Why does it take so long? Number one, there's not an incentive to prosecute voter fraud. The laws are so weak. When Nevada went after Acorn for the first time as an organization, because previously they had only been able to go after the employees, but Nevada went after the organization for voter fraud and voter registration fraud. They were able to get them, and they pled guilty. But what did they get? A 6-month slap on the wrist for their chief organizer, and now she's back. Her name is Amy Boosfink. She's back over at Project Vote right now, running a 1.3 million voter registration drive for 2012 because of that 6-month slap on the wrist and probation. So we have to not only strengthen the electoral laws, but also strengthen the penalties for voter fraud. We need to make it a serious crime. We need to have incentive for our attorney generals and our state attorneys to go after these people, because in most cases, it's political suicide. If they go after voter fraud the way it's supposed to, the left will automatically attack them. If you go and you look at the articles, I have a Google alert for every time the word vote or voter fraud is mentioned. And I would say 10-1, the articles are always coming from the left. They call it the myth of voter fraud, or GOP suppression efforts, or, when King Street Patriots opened their new office, they said it was a vote suppression superstore. I mean, all types of ridiculous claims, but they have the echo chamber. They control the narrative. So we are not getting out there and protecting the people that are behind election integrity. If every single story that comes out says voter ID is bad and it disenfranchises blacks, if a regular person picks up that newspaper, they're going to think voter ID is bad because we don't have anything coming from our side. We need to learn to protect the people that are doing this. If you hear that Nikki Haley is fighting for photo ID, it's time to get people behind her, get articles out there, get people supporting her. If you hear that Rick Perry's fighting against the DOJ in Texas, we need to get behind our officials that are actually fighting back. Bobby Jindal in Louisiana, they're fighting a voter fraud, voter ID lawsuit right now, filed by the DOJ, and one simultaneously filed by Project Vote and the Brennan Center for Justice, along with the NAACP. If this happens, let me tell you, I just came back from Baton Rouge about a month ago, and I sat there with the state attorney and the Secretary of State, and we went over the lawsuit in detail, and what they're asking for in discovery, they're asking for full DMV records, full Health and Human Services records for the entire state, and all of the records from the public assistance agencies. If they get that information, they will not have to turn it back in. They don't have any restrictions on what they can do with it. What do you think that's going to end up? In one of those massive databases that Obama controls, like the VAN, the Voter Activation Network, that's run out of Chicago. It's one thing to have voting rolls. It's another thing to have key demographic information that ties into those voting rolls. It will be amazing how they can target people, just like they were targeting homes for health care. They were out there micro-targeting and running ground games right around you people, and you never knew it because they knew how to micro-target. They knew which houses to knock on, which doors to ignore. In 2008, SEIU contacted over 48% of the people that cast a ballot. And I bet they never knocked on your door or your door because they knew not to. Demographic information is the key to manipulating the voter rolls because you understand your voters in a way that no one else has the type of information. So this is what they're requesting during discovery. Imagine what the consent agreement that the DOJ is trying to force Louisiana to sign looks like. It will give up all of their rights, and they will, of course, since they're under the Voting Rights Act, they will, of course, be subjected to even more types of monitoring and restrictions. So what do? We get behind them. One of the great things about the NVRA is that it has the right of private action. That is Section 8 of the NVRA. The right of private action means that any citizen can sue the Secretary of State after notice. The notice is a letter that you send to them. You let them know that the voting rolls are inflated and that they have a certain X amount of days to clean them up, which is usually 20 days, or you will file a lawsuit against them. You as a private citizen can do that. J. Christian Adams, the DOJ whistleblower, has been going across the country sending these letters out to Secretary of States. And what do? They'll clear off a couple of thousand before the 20-day deadline and send a letter back. So then what do? You go back to the voting rolls, you see how many more people are on there, you point those out, and you send another letter. They will usually clear the rolls out to avoid a lawsuit. But if they're really stubborn and they're holding out like they would in Ohio and Minnesota and some other places, then you sue them. We have to be the change that we see in the world, as Gandhi said. We can't sit around and wait for someone to do it for us because they're going to keep stealing elections right from under our noses. When I was with Acorn from 2004 to 2008, they registered 7 million unmatched voters. And when I say unmatched voters, I mean those were all Democrats. There was nowhere near that number coming in from the right. So what was Obama's margin of victory? Around 5 million? They created their margin of victory through the voter registration drives across the country. They made it seem like America stood up and spoke in shining colors from sea to sea, and that wasn't the case. It was strategic voter fraud that started back in '04. It was strategic voting of the rolls, and in key states, they will still not let them clean the voter rolls. In New Mexico, they had the first Republican Secretary of State in 82 years. And before she could even take office good, 2 people from the DOJ flew to New Mexico to tell her that she could not clean her voting rolls up until 2015 because of what her Democrat predecessor had done to mess it up so much. There are more people on the voting rolls than there are voting age population in New Mexico, and she can't do anything about it. So what do? I told her that we need to start thinking like the leftist thing. She needs a Republican, I told her. Find a Republican to sue the New Mexico Secretary of State under the Voting Rights Act of 1965, claiming that the inflated voter rolls are disenfranchising minorities. The same thing that the left would do, only we turn it around on them and use it to clean up the rolls instead of weakening our electoral laws. We have to get ahead of the game. We have to be bold, we have to be aggressive, and we have to protect our electoral system at any cost. If not, we're not going to have free and fair elections. What we have now is only a semblance of free and fair elections. And that's one of the reasons why True the Vote came up. If you guys have heard of True the Vote in Houston, it started out with a woman named Catherine Engelbrecht. And she started looking around at the voting rolls and she wanted to do something to help. I don't think that she ever expected that she would become a leader of a voting rights movement. At the time, they just wanted to clean up the rolls in Harris County, Texas. They had 23,000 fraudulent registrations that were brought in by a group called Houston Votes. Houston Votes is an offshoot of a group called America Votes. America Votes is a coalition of groups that consisted of Project Vote, Acorn, SEIU, Emily's List, the League of Women Voters, and a host of the usual suspects on the left. It was started in 2004 with a $50,000 buy-in from each organization, and the goal was to do registration drives across the country, but to provide cover for the groups that were involved. So, oh no, it wasn't Acorn out there running that voter registration drive. It was America Votes, or it was, whatever, Houston Votes, or Florida Votes, or whatever name they wanted to give it. And they were doing this across the country. They were accused of aggressive tactics. And one of the people that sat on the board was Jonathan Soros. Jonathan Soros is George Soros' son. So just because, guys, George Soros is in his 80s, believe me, his sons have been groomed to continue on with the process. And he sat on the board of America Votes and also America Coming Together Act, which was another voter registration group that had to disband after being accused of thug-like tactics and getting voters to register during the 2004 election. So what you have is a legacy of voter registration fraud groups that have worked together and are providing cover for each other. Now that Acorn is bankrupt, who's out there talking about this stuff for Project Vote? The Advancement Project, DEMOS, DEMOS. These groups are providing cover for Acorn, but we can prove through FOIA, Freedom of Information Act requests, that the people that are controlling this are Acorn, Project Vote, and Obama's old cronies, and they're all working through the DOJ. This is a serious problem. What are we as our citizens going to do about it? Number one, Know your laws. Know the laws in your state. Know how HAVA works in your state. Every state had to file a plan as to how they were going to implement HAVA, the Help America Vote Act of 2002. Once they filed that plan, it had to be approved by the state and then sent to the federal government before funds would be released. You know how many people are compliant with HAVA right now? How many states? 0. If your state is not compliant with a federal law, you have the right to pressure your Secretary of State, to have a public outcry, to get people behind you. Because as long as no one's talking about it, they're not going to do anything about it. But if everyone's demanding that they clean the voting rolls, that they become compliant with HAVA, that voter registrations are verified through either the driver's license records or the Social Security databases, this is not going to happen because the left is out there making sure that they comply with provisional voting. So we need to make sure they comply with the list maintenance side of HAVA. And if the states aren't compliant, we need to make them get compliant because they're in violation of federal law. So there are so many things that we as private citizens can do. I urge all of you to go to the website truethevote.org, because poll watching may just be one day, or it may be 2 weeks if you have early voting, but there's a host of other activities that you can do during the election year. And I'll save questions for the end. truethevote.org. And truethevote.org, True the Vote. And you can find out about legislation that can be pushed through during your sessions that will allow to strengthen not only the laws for prosecuting voter fraud, but also incentives for your attorney general to go after these cases. Because as long as they're not prosecuting, the left is able to claim that voter fraud does not exist. But there are cases in every single city and county across the country, but no one wants to go after them because you do all that work and you get vilified by the left and then the person gets a slap on the wrist. It's not worth it to these prosecutors to do it. We have to do things in the off year, such as strengthen the laws and work on the voting rolls. And as Catherine Engelbrecht says, observation changes behavior. We need to be at these polling places across the country. Now, what happened in Harris County, Texas, when we first went out there, and I say we because I was on the ground with Catherine in 2010, chasing Quanell X from the New Black Panthers around as he went from polling place to polling place, trying to throw out these poll watchers. And what we did see is, number one, observation does change behavior. A lot of these people were trained incorrectly, and they weren't trying to be a part of some big conspiracy to commit fraud. They just didn't know any better, because no one had ever told them the right way to do it. So that was number one, making sure they're following the rule of law and they're doing the right things. And number two, they accused us of voter suppression, voter intimidation, 1960s-style voter suppression at that. They said that we were going to jail any day now, and there was a bullet hole where someone drove by and shot at the office. So all of this stuff was happening, but when you saw on the ground was that inside the polling places, people were at first a little leery. They didn't know what to expect. They thought people were going to be in there trying to stop folks from voting. But when they realized that it was just everyday citizens and Americans, by the end of the 2-week early voting period in Houston, they were hugging them like old friends and telling them to come back. The only people that were screaming voter suppression were the Black Panthers and Sheila Jackson Lee, because they needed that. Sheila Jackson Lee has more people in her county that live underground in a way you can't see than anywhere else. We walked her precinct. People were registered at concrete blocks and, park benches and the local McDonald's in the bathroom, I guess, I don't know. But, most people had a level of fraud that was right here, just a little bit. Sheila Jackson Lee's level was here, double the average for Texas. And she had a vested interest in keeping us out of her district. So that's what you need to know, that they will accuse you guys of intimidation or whatever, but that is only the agitators. The regular people, they welcome the help. And we've been back every election cycle since, and we'll be back in 2012. The goal for True the Vote is to put 1 million poll watchers across the country. And that's what we're going to do, and we need you guys to get out there. And if you can't become poll watchers, you can watch outside the polls, you can drive people to the polls, and you know what else, just to wrap it up, Also, pay attention to absentee ballots. We have had so many people that have had their votes stolen because they are not able to move around or they're not in the right mental faculties, and people are requesting ballots and voting for them. If you have people in assistance homes, or if you want to go out there and work with the mentally ill or disabled, make sure people aren't taking their ballots. Make sure that they have the ballots that are being counted, and if they need rides on election day, work with the local candidates and see if you can get a free van from them that does not endorse any candidate, and take the people to the polls, because that benefits everybody. There is so much we can do to get involved. Go to choosthevote.org and find out what you can do, and thank you guys so much for having me here today. Thank you. Thank you. Now, if we have any questions, we're going to open it up for a couple of questions. Right here in front.
No.
Miscounted. You know, when you're out petition, you know, when a candidate's out petitioning, have you ever had any problems where they would actually miscount the votes? In other words, well, let me put it this way. When I was out petitioning, I had a big issue with the voter's office, because they were. I mean, you know, if I'm counting the petitions 3 or 4 times before I take them in, and then they're taking 20 or 30 less than what I actually took into them, then I had a really big issue with it. So I had to go ahead and have an appointment with them and everything else. And I even told the supervisor of election that if you can't even count the petitions correctly, how do I even know the votes are counted correctly? So I was wondering if you ever had any issues with people having problems when they're out petitioning. Because, see, the problem I'm running against is that the person that's ahead of the supervisor election is actually Republican, and I really believe that they don't want me in office.
Well, what you may want to consider, now petitions are a little different from what happens with the voting machines, because the voting machines usually do a pretty fairly accurate count. We did have a situation in Wisconsin, because we also run verifytherecall.com, and we were getting people to volunteer to look at the signatures, because there's a problem with, you know, fraudulent signatures, with them not counting them correctly, or just counting signatures that should be counted. So that does happen a lot with petitions. It's happened in Ohio before. Jennifer Bruner threw out one candidate's whole set of petition signatures to get them on the ballot because she didn't like them. But the Secretary of State has a lot of power, which is why we need to always follow the money and find out who our Secretary of State really works for. And thank you, Bill, for the water. Whoever brought the water over. Yes.
Rolando Perez from Bear Witness. There's a lot of information about electronic voting machines being used to commit fraud. And also, we now hear reports that a Spanish company is going to be counting votes from overseas. Do you have any information on that, or what is your group?
Michelle Malkin has done an in-depth report on that. I would urge you to go to michellemalkin.com and check that out. You could just look under voting. It's listed there. And I will tell you that we've had a big problem with that across the country, because the voting machines are being maintained by public sector union employees. And in Nevada and Chicago and other states, that's SEIU, the Service Employees International Union. They have the keys that open up the machines. They can switch out the cards and everything. So we need to make sure that what we're doing is not only protecting the integrity of the elections, but getting these unions out of there. You know, I told the people in Nevada, we have to fight back against the public sector unions. They should not have access and overnight access to the voting machines.
Hi. Where are you from?
I'm
Which
from
state?
Birmingham, Alabama.
Okay.
Roll Tide.
Are you familiar with, here in Florida, there's a growing investigation about voter fraud here, where they're finding they're finally getting around to matching some of the driver's license records with voter records, and they're finding a lot of non-citizens. The last of a series of articles that I've seen is the number's 180,000 now. Now
Yes.
there are reasons that maybe it's not that high. I was a corporate information systems auditor. I understand computers. I am just blown away by the lack of use of common data analysis and validation techniques in this state, and maybe others. I mean, and when I talked to our local elections official in Lake County, she just says, well, I'm waiting for whatever is sent to me by Department of State. And I said, well, why don't you test 100 items yourself and see if they're dead people or not? And it's like it right over their heads. And so we really need a much more improved explanation. To me, it's common because I used to work around that all the time. But a lot of these officials, and apparently the state officials, don't understand how to do good validation techniques to pick up a lot of this stuff automatically with computer databases.
No, they're complacent, and they've been told not to go after these things. I mean, there's something that the left likes to call voter caging, which happens every time the right tries to clean the list up. And it's basically non-compliance under the Help America Vote Act. I found that if they were to go through and really do the list, there would be more than 180,000 that are not verified either through driver's license or Social Security records. So I'm glad at least Florida is doing it now before the election, but how many other states are not in compliance right now? It's just disgusting.
Hi, wanted to thank you first. You said so much that I had a lot of trouble keeping up with you. I'm going to ask you 2 questions, and then I'm going to let you answer both of them, and I'll sit down. The first one is, since the inflated voting rolls, I was listening to what you said about Section 8, and it's brilliant. But since it affects all of us nationally, can we sue another Secretary of State in another state? Do we have standing since it affects us nationally? I would think the answer is yes, but I want to hear what you would have to say. The other thing is, you said we have to work to get the SEIU out of the voting machines. Specifically, do you have any ways that we can do that? Thanks.
Well, number one, as far as, I'm not sure about standing in other states. It's usually, it has to be the state that you live in because it directly affects you. But you may want to check with the Election Law Center, which is the electionlawcenter.com. It's run by J. Christian Adams, the DOJ whistleblower. He's a lawyer and he's been filing these lawsuits. He would be able to answer that for you. And also, as far as getting the public sector unions out, that is something that we're going to have to take on a local level across the country because we also need to get them out of the public schools as well. But when we see the kind of havoc that the SEIU is running and what has happened with the health care, who do you think is organizing everyone under this universal health care? That's going to be SEIU. They've pumped in $20 million so far to get Obama elected, and that was just in 2008. Imagine how much money is going in this cycle. We have to hold the unions accountable for their political activity and try to get them. Well, one of the things is to look where the money is going. They're just as accountable under RICO statutes as anyone else is. We do have documents and information that tie them into money laundering and criminal activity. We have to push Darrell Issa of the House Government Oversight and Reform Committee to do investigations, and also we need to push our local law enforcement and FBI to investigate the criminal activity and the money laundering of these unions. But it's not politically popular, especially if they're on that side. So it's going to be an uphill battle, but we are going to have to fight the unions if we're going to win. And thank you. I think that's it. But
I think one more question here at the end, and then we'll wrap it up here. She's on her way with the microphone. There we go.
George Soros, he wants like crazy to get Mr. Obama reelected, and he's going to be spending, instead of advertising for political ideals, he wants to put all his money, millions of dollars, into the electoral process. And do you think, well, you gave us ideas of what we could do, but do you think he'll be successful in doing this with all his millions and billions?
I think he's very smart and strategic. He knows that the ads really don't work. What really got Obama elected in 2008 was the ground game. They got everybody involved. They got him out there. Now you have a bunch of disillusioned youth that are not really behind Obama, so you kind of have to tinker with the process a little bit to make sure that you still get the votes you need. So I think he's strategic, and he's probably going to be successful, which is why we have to be vigilant. We have to get out there and run our own ground game, because what happened in 2008, and I hate to say this, but I'm just going to be honest, white guilt got Obama elected. People tried to prove that they weren't racist, and they went out there and they voted against their values and put him in, and the ones that couldn't vote for him just stayed home. We can't have that. We have the numbers. So if we get out there and we get our ground game on, we start doing house parties, information parties, and push our people to the polls, we can win, because they don't have the numbers, which is why they have to cheat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita Moncrief. Thank you.